so much, Liz. I'm so delighted to be here. And thank you to everyone behind the scenes who helped get this thing off the ground and all the wonderful presenters. It's a real honor to be presenting beside you today. So I'll just share my screen here. Pull up my presentation. All right. So I thought we would start today by talking about how to use exercise to manage your migraine and improve neck health. And in order to get started, I thought we should talk about what the literature says about the effect of exercise on migraine in adults. And so in order to prepare for this presentation, I looked at a few studies. I looked at three randomized controlled trials and a couple of systematic reviews. And they all looked at the effect of aerobic exercise, which is defined as any activity which increases your heart rate and your breathing rate in order to deliver oxygen to the working tissues, and its effect on pain. And so the parameters that these studies looked at were the effects on pain intensity, so that number out of 10 that you report to your clinicians, the pain frequency of your migraine, so how often you're having migraine during a month, as well as the duration of your migraine, which is usually reported in minutes. And what was interesting is that a couple of these studies actually looked at the effect of exercise intensity, which is kind of a new development in the evidence. And so I will share those findings with you now. So one of the key findings was that frequency of migraine pain is affected by aerobic exercise. And these were both statistically and clinically significant findings, and both moderate and intense activity was found to be effective in decreasing migraine frequency in days per month. It was also notable in the studies that, in particular in one study, that the migraine frequency was also decreased 6 months after the exercise intervention. And so I thought that was quite a helpful piece of info. Exercise intensity was also shown to decrease migraine. This parameter seemed more influenced by moderate exercise rather than intense exercise, but both were effective in decreasing migraine pain intensity for participants. Now, migraine duration was also impacted positively with aerobic activity. Again, both moderate and intense exercise were found to be effective on migraine duration. And one research group actually found a 20 to 27% decrease in migraine duration using aerobic exercise intervention. So in conclusion, it seems quite clear that aerobic activity is really effective to decrease all parameters of pain. Migraine frequency is most affected by aerobic exercise, but all pain parameters were improved upon with the use of aerobic activity. And so this begs the question, how does exercise help? Like, what are the mechanisms behind these positive effects of exercise? And there were a couple of interesting papers which spoke to this question. Overall, exercise seems to increase the endorphin levels in the body. And there are, a number of rather complicated biochemical processes involved in this. But basically, it seems that the circulating levels of endorphins are increased. They tend to inhibit pain pathways, increase dopamine levels in the body. And so this is really helpful for migraine patients. Migraineurs are known to have lower circulating endorphin levels typically, and so, as compared to the general population. And so we know that exercise can be a really powerful tool, particularly for migraine sufferers, in terms of modulating that pain experience. The other effect that exercise seems to have on the body is this overall effect of decreasing inflammation. And so we've noticed that aerobic exercise in particular increases anti-inflammatory biomarkers in the body, as well as decreasing some of the pro-inflammatory biomarkers that circulate. And so one example of this is that exercise has been shown to increase nitric oxide, or NO, levels in the body. And NO is a very powerful vasodilator, regulates the tone of the vasculature. And so in one Turkish study, they measured this in migraine patients and found that the circulating level of this biochemical increased. And so these are some of the ways that exercise may be helpful in modulating migraine pain, but there is an opportunity for more research in this area. I was very encouraged actually at the body of evidence that is growing around the effect of exercise with migraine. It's certainly increasing over the last few years, but there are some questions that remain. One of these is, does exercise augment the effect of migraine medications? This would be really helpful information to know. And there is some speculation that this may be the case. I didn't find anything conclusive in the literature about this question, but there is speculation that, in fact, exercise might actually improve the effect of commonly prescribed migraine medications. Are other forms of exercise helpful for migraine? And I would love to see more information develop in the literature about this question. There was very little that I found other than studies that examined aerobic activity. There was a yoga study that I looked at that showed some good impacts, but it wasn't an extremely well done study, but it seemed to suggest that yoga was helpful. But at the moment, most of the studies available evaluate aerobic activity and their effect on migraine pain. Hopefully there'll be more that will develop in this area in terms of the research. Does exercise trigger migraine? This is one of the key questions I get asked quite frequently. And the evidence that I looked at actually did not show any adverse effect. So meaning none of these studies showed any migraine triggering from the protocols that they were using. However, we know that anecdotally our patients report that at times exercise, and usually more intense exercise, can trigger migraine. And so I wonder if the possibility is that the patients who are experiencing exercise as a trigger have a particularly high trigger load that day. That may be part of the explanation, but the evidence does not show that exercise triggers migraine. One of the questions that I'm particularly interested in as an exercise physiologist are, what are the specific volumes and intensities of exercise which are needed to improve migraine pain? And unfortunately, all of the protocols were quite different in the studies I looked at, and so it's difficult to conclude what volume and what intensity is the perfect recipe for helping to modulate migraine pain. So in light of what the evidence shows, the main question here is, what are the rules of the road? Like, what are we telling patients about how to utilize exercise as a tool to manage migraine pain? And so to help with that, I've come up with a few, rules, and I'll expand on these each as we go. The first is never do nothing. The second is exercise with respect to pain, not in spite of pain. And the third is be mindful of posture. So my rule, never do nothing. You'll forgive the obvious grammatical error. It was intentional. It'll stick with you better that way, I think. This is basically the pacing principle, and I'm going to try and distill pacing with respect to exercise the best I can. Pacing could be a whole presentation in and of itself. But fundamentally, when it comes to exercise, what we want to try and avoid is the tendency to do absolutely no activity during times of higher pain or trigger load, and doing everything when you're feeling much better, right? And so you have this large discrepancy in activity levels over time. And what we want to try and do is bring those levels down towards each other a little bit, so the peaks and valleys aren't so different from each other. And in this way, you kind of achieve more control of your migraine pain. And so this requires some strategizing and some planning. You know, pacing is not something, it's not a reactionary principle. It's something very intentional and something that requires some forethought and possibly some strategizing and delegating. And it will allow you as the migraine patient to regain some control, right? And I think this is what I hear so often from my migraine patients, is that the migraine is controlling everything. It's controlling how much activity is done, how functional people are in their lives. And it's a very, very upsetting and unsettling experience. And so learning how to pace appropriately with respect to exercise can be really, really helpful. The second rule that I like to share with people is this idea that we must exercise with respect to pain. Now, coming from a really athletic past and working in the beginning of my career mostly with elite athletes, there's this real sort of trend and celebration of the philosophy of no pain, no gain. And I would just love it if that whole idea could get, thrown out. It's really, really not helpful for most people, in fact, not just migraineurs. We need to consider pain when we're looking at exercise strategies. And we need to develop a flexible approach to exercise. And this can be awfully challenging, particularly with the trend towards, Facebook challenges and, 30 days of, whatever the exercise strategy is that people, get on board with. And, don't get me wrong, for some people, those are great strategies to increase adherence to exercise. But I find them a frustrating approach for many of my patients. This idea that exercise adherence or being able to, stick to a plan is only about motivation and only about good intention. And it's just really not a realistic approach, particularly for those suffering with pain. And so I like to help my patients to develop a flexible plan, which means that we create a strategy for exercise that has a different goal for higher pain or higher trigger days. So for example, the goal of exercise when you're really, struggling with migraine pain may be more therapeutic. It may have a more, relaxation focus, a breath focus. It is aimed at hopefully helping to reduce some of that pain experience. Whereas the exercise approach that might be appropriate for a day with lower pain and lower trigger load, you may be able to exercise to increase your fitness and sort of reach some of those goals. And so I think it's important to create some strategies for this. And, this isn't actually much different than sport performance programming. When we create periodized programs for athletes, we build in rest days. And, they are probably at first the least popular days for an athlete to encounter because they want to do their training, but they are critical to the body adapting to the training that we're doing. It's, this is a lot like if you were to do, high altitude hiking and trekking. You climb to a point and then you have to stop and allow your body to adjust to that altitude and adapt, and then you continue your climb. And so we can really reframe this idea of taking of lower activity and consider it as a relevant and important part of our overall exercise strategy. Now, there's a principle that exercise professionals use when creating exercise prescriptions for people, and it's called the FIT principle. So frequency, intensity, time, and type of exercise are all parameters that we can manipulate to create these flexible programs. And the two parameters that I tend to focus on with migraine patients are time, because it's really simple, and intensity. Intensity is typically measured, in the lab with heart rate and so on. But for migraine patients, because there is medications are on board and heart rate may not be as reliable, or people may not have that technology available, we can use the talk test to measure how hard exercise feels or intensity. And so if you're exercising at a moderate level, you'll be able to have a conversation, but it'll be a bit challenging for you. Whereas when you get to a more intense activity level, conversation should be near impossible. And that's how you can kind of gauge what the intensity is. Now, I tend to suggest for people who are experiencing a higher trigger load or higher pain, that intensity is the parameter that we tend to drop off into a moderate zone most frequently. And you can play with intensity on days where your pain and trigger loads are lower. I think what the evidence shows is that we don't need to be as afraid of using higher intensity or HIIT training strategies, which are really time effective and have excellent benefits for migraine patients. And so that's quite an encouraging finding. Time is the other parameter that is really easy to manipulate. On a good day, maybe your tolerance for activity is somewhere around 30 or 40 minutes, but on a day where your pain is higher, you may be looking at a 15 or 20 minute time frame for your duration of activity. Now, type is also something I want to quickly talk about, because exercise type can be quite important for migraineurs. First of all, I really believe that the type of exercise you choose to engage in should be something you enjoy. And this often comes as a surprise to my patients that joyfulness or enjoyment really factors in. But I found that most people aren't going to stick with something that they really don't like doing. And so I encourage you to have a varied sort of diet of activity choices at your disposal. Think of 3 or 4 things that you really like. And if you are a person who doesn't like exercise at all, at least pick something that is tolerable to you, and you'll be much more likely to stick with it. The national exercise recommendations are quite significant, and I wanted to share them with you. It is recommended that we get 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous exercise. And this can be a really intimidating number for patients with migraine. And so I tend to recommend dividing and conquering, right? That doesn't have to happen, obviously, all at the same time. Over the course of a week, if we're looking at 150 minutes, even over 5 days, this works out to only 30 minutes a day. Now, that may be a robust expectation if you're in the middle of a migraine cycle. So we can even break that down further and think of 15-minute bouts of exercise twice a day. And that might look like going to get your kids from school if you're able to walk, or up to the post office, and then something else a little bit later. So there are ways that we can achieve these national recommendations of exercise. But even if it is not possible to do that much activity, there are health benefits which are derived from doing less than the recommended amount. So I guess my suggestion is, if you can't do everything, or you can't do the ideal number, always do something. I guess this circles back to that first rule: never do nothing. The cumulative benefit of exercise over time is significant and helpful, both for your health and for your migraine pain. And something that's really important as well is to track activity with respect to pain. And so much like an activity, or rather a medication diary, I often suggest to my patients just taking a quick note of what you did, how long you did it for, what was your pain before and after your exercise event, can help us determine if that strategy is really working for you in terms of modulating pain. My last rule, and possibly my favorite, is being mindful of posture. Now, oftentimes people believe that posture with respect to headache is primarily about the neck, but this isn't true. Obviously, the head is connected to the pelvis via a spine, and so we really have to pay attention to good posture of the whole body. Most of us are quite familiar with this particular posture, hunching over our devices or our phones, or reaching our heads forward to look at our computer screens all the time, especially during COVID. And we know that body mechanics truly do affect efficiency, and particularly when we've been holding our bodies in a pain avoidance posture. This has an effect on pain levels. Posture can be a very powerful tool in helping to manage pain. And actually, we all know how to achieve good posture. We can look at this image of this child sitting on the ground and know that, the minute a baby learns to sit up, it is sitting in perfectly neutral posture. And so the effort here is to remind ourselves about how to find good posture again. And actually, there are some very simple ways to do this. And we can all try this now. Just sitting up in the chair and sitting up right on top of the sit bones, back away from the chair, and thinking about the crown of the head, sort of like reaching towards the ceiling, relaxing the front of the neck. And you can even imagine a book on the top of your head that you're balancing. This is neutral posture, okay? And so the more often we practice this posture and get accustomed to it, the more habitual it will become, and the more power I think that it has then to help manage headache pain. So I hope that some of these tips have been helpful for you. I truly encourage all of you to explore how exercise can help you to manage your migraine pain and empower you to sort of take that control back of your activity and your lives. I love this quote from Carol Welch, and she says, "Movement is a medicine for creating change in a person's physical, emotional, and mental states." And we certainly know that migraine affects all of these aspects of your health. And so I wish you hope and encourage you to continue to find strategies, including activity, that will help you to manage your migraine and improve your quality of life. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Shannon. Really, really appreciate it. So many questions coming in, so we'll try to get to a couple of them. Obviously, I truly believe motion is lotion, movement is medicine. That biopsychosocial approach really also includes that lifestyle changes that really are so important when we're moving forward in this. One of the questions that came in, and let me just pull it up, sorry, was about what type of exercise you would suggest. Is it, anything specific that you think is best for people?
Okay, that's a good question. So I do love aerobic exercise as a starting point for people. Obviously, the evidence supports that recommendation as well. Sometimes just going for a walk is a very good start. And so walking is something that anybody can do. It doesn't require a gym membership. Sometimes nice weather is a helpful motivator for a walking program, but intensity can be improved with walking by adding stairs or hills or pace. Time is typically something that's easy to adjust for as well. But there, again, I think it's really helpful to use a diary to record what exercise has either not triggered pain or giving you the best bang for your, exercise buck. And so, but typically I start most of my patients on a walking program.
Excellent. And one last question is about exercising. Do you recommend exercising during the migraine, or is it more of a preventative measure?
Oh, that's a really good question, Rob. There have been very few people that have told me that exercising during a migraine episode is helpful. I mean, most of the time you're wanting to exercise before or after. Some patients have told me that, during that aura period, it can be helpful to mitigate, but this is, I think very patient dependent. And so I think the effort would be to exercise as a preventative means of modulating migraine. Usually people want the sunglasses in a dark room when the episode is occurring, and that's understandable.
That has been my experience. So I guess the last question that comes in is kind of suggestions of how to start. Who do you go to? Is there online resources? How do we get moving again? And I think the concept of pacing is often misused, and I see it so often where people are basically told to stop doing things and that they're overdoing and they have to pace and they end up doing nothing. And I loved that slide, never do nothing or don't do nothing. I mean, where pacing is really about start where you can start and building it up till you find your thresholds. How does someone get connected to somebody to do this, knowing that, the system isn't very easy to navigate and find that?
That is such a good question, Rob. And I've looked actually at what resources are available for patients. I should probably create something for people because I haven't found anything in terms of a group that people can go to when they're exercising with migraine. I often find that people looking for a therapeutic exercise approach seem to gravitate towards Pilates or yoga because the perception is that's much more therapeutic. But as far as migraine support and exercise, there's not a lot that I've found on the web at this point. Certainly reaching out to a clinical exercise physiologist such as myself or, through the PCNs may be an option for patients.
Well, you are going to be overwhelmed with that offer. So
that's wonderful.
Yeah, brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, Shannon, and excited to hand it over to Liz.